No landscape in America is more closely associated to indigenous people than the Great Plains of North America. Odds are that the indigenous people of the Great Plains, like the Lakota, the Blackfeet, Kiowa, and Arapaho, are the people that you imagine when you think of Native Americans. The image of nomadic peoples riding their horses under a big sky and hunting bison across the vast open plains is deeply ingrained into the American mind. The reality is that this was a very recent development, a tiny sliver of a much larger picture that goes back over 10,000 years. Before the frontier wars, before the horses, and contact with Europe, people on the plains lived very different lives. It's tempting to describe the plains as a wasteland like many early explorers did, but this vast area was actually a thriving landscape that many nations, people, and cultures called home. As we'll see, there's an unappreciated complexity on the plains. Plains people were not just nomadic bison hunters. Many practiced agriculture, lived in villages, and maintained close links to their eastern woodland neighbors. Life on the plains was more varied than we give it credit. So before we dive into this episode, let's take those images of the plains horsemen out of our heads and give ourselves a clean slate, because this is going to be really interesting. This episode is brought to you by my amazing patrons. Not only do they support me financially, but they actually suggested this amazing topic. You guys have wonderful curiosity. If you, my dear viewer, would like to support the show and suggest and vote on topics, you can do so on Patreon. And now back to our regularly scheduled program. The Great Plains are a geographic wonder. They stretch from the foothills of the Rocky Mountains to roughly the 94th meridian, as far north as Alberta and Saskatchewan, all the way down to central Texas. Don't get the idea that this is a single uniform biome. Early American settlers may have bemoaned the plains as the Great American Desert and thought of it as a barrier to westward expansion, but in reality, there's a deceptive amount of diversity here. After all, we're talking about an area over 1 million square kilometers or 500,000 square miles. Rivers cut into the plains, sometimes hundreds of feet below the surrounding landscape, and run generally from west to east before draining into the Missouri, Mississippi, and Rio Grande rivers. Despite having a reputation as a flat expanse, there's some topography such as the Black Hills, the Nebraska Sand Hills, and the Arbuckle Mountains. Good lithic material and flakable stone deposits are spread out across the plains, and these were important resources for indigenous peoples. Rainfall follows a general pattern in this area, with increased precipitation in the east and less in the west due to the western air flows losing a lot of their moisture over the Rocky Mountains. Rainfall averages from as little as 30 to 33 centimeters in the western plains to as much as 64 to 76 centimeters per year on the eastern edge of the plains, but this can vary according to local topography. The Black Hills, for example, receive more rainfall than the surrounding plains. Wind is a constant feature on the expanses of the plains. These can climax as brutal storms in the summer and freezing winds in the winter, but at their deadliest, they can manifest in tornadoes. Those who live in the United States might know this area by its unfortunate but well-earned nickname, Tornado Alley. These conditions impact the local vegetation, and this helps create a changing landscape. In the eastern edges, parkland appears as the woodlands thin out and give way to tall grass prairie. Moving further west, this changes to mixed grass prairie followed by small grass prairie in the west. Near the southwest, the prairies turn into desert grassland. Trees can be found on the prairie edges and along rivers and streams. Before colonization, the grasslands were dominated by grazing animals like pronghorn, deer, elk, and of course the bison. Other small game like foxes, raccoons, prairie dogs, and skunks were also present in the landscape. Now, the Great Plains is a huge area, the largest single area that we've focused on in one of our cultural overviews. In discussing the area and its people, I'll try to keep things generalized a bit, but I will do my best to call out exceptions when they are important. If you really want to go into the weeds on this topic, I highly recommend getting a hold of Douglas Bamforth's excellent book, The Archaeology of the North American Great Plains. I can confidently say that it is the best current book that tackles the pre-Columbian cultures and lifeways of the Great Plains. I do also want to illustrate the main areas of the plains that I'll be referencing in this episode: the northern plains, the central plains, and the southern plains. Also, I do want to give an obligatory look at the chronology. Plains archaeologists break up the timeline into 5 distinct periods: the Paleoindian period, the Archaic, the Woodland period, the Plains Village period, and finally the Historic period. We're going to be focusing on the first 4 periods in this episode. We'll also be sticking primarily to archaeology and material culture. Plains beliefs and customs are better discussed when we zoom into individual cultures in later episodes. So let's turn back the clock and start by zooming in on the Paleoindian period. The earliest well-documented inhabitants of the plains should be no strangers to regular viewers of the channel, because they are none other than the Clovis people. Just a recap for the new folks, Clovis culture is one of the oldest documented cultures in the Americas, and they date to a narrow time period from 11,500 to 10,800 BCE, and are known for the distinct points that they produced. Although it's almost certain that earlier people were on the plains, we lack strong evidence for them. We know, for instance, that there's very strong evidence of humans at White Sands, New Mexico, dating to 21,000 years ago, which isn't too far from the edge of the modern Great Plains. There's some interesting, albeit circumstantial, evidence of pre-Clovis occupation on the plains at several sites containing the remains of large Pleistocene mammals like mammoths that may suggest human involvement, but also have not yielded any hard evidence of human activity. A good example is the Lasena site in southern Nebraska. Here, large mammoth bones dating back 20,000 years ago were found broken very systematically, despite there being no gnawing marks and no geological explanations for the breaks. More delicate bones, like ribs, were not broken. However, no flake tools were found, and no cut marks were found on the bones, so it's hard to say that this was the result of human hunting. Steve Holin, the lead archaeologist at the excavation, suggests that people may have scavenged these bones for tool material, but without better evidence of human activity, archaeologists can't definitively say that people were on the plains 20,000 years ago. Bummer. This is why we're going to start at Clovis culture. This is where humans really come into focus on the plains. One quick disclaimer. When I say Clovis people, don't think of these people as a single ethnic or cultural group. The only thing that unites them is that they used a common type of tool. Nobody would talk about a blue jeans culture today because blue jeans cross all kinds of ethnic, cultural, and religious lines. They are not specific to a people or culture in the 21st century. Clovis tools were a technology that was likely adopted by different people across the North American continent. During the Paleoindian period, the plains would have looked very different from how they appear now. Remember, this is the end of the Pleistocene, so the northern plains would have been covered by massive glaciers, and this meant that the plains environment was cooler and wetter than it is today. Modern reconstructions of this environment south of the glaciers have shown that the landscape would have been a vegetate polar and alpine desert before giving way to more open steppe grasslands dotted with spruce and pines. However, after about 20,000 years ago, the climate was starting to warm and the glaciers were retreating. During this time, there was an incredible array of wildlife on the plains that would have put the modern Serengeti to shame. We're talking about a landscape that was dominated by mastodons, Columbian mammoths, giant steppe bison, horses, lions, saber-toothed cats, short-faced bears, and dire wolves. For my money, this would have been a terrifying zoo to be living in, but hey, credit to the people who thrived among these guys. Clovis people have a reputation as big game hunters, and it's common to see them depicted hunting giant megafauna like mammoths. Now, there certainly are many Clovis sites that show evidence of butchering large animals, and it's tempting to assume that this was the norm for these hunters. However, if we stop looking at butchering sites and focus on Clovis campsites, there's a much broader array of resources being exploited. A good example is the Aubrey site in Texas, which has some bison remains, but also remains of deer, rabbits, fish, and rodents. The truth is that Clovis hunters exploited a range of different animals. Unfortunately, we have very little evidence about plants that were used due to poor preservation. We can also see that many Clovis people were highly mobile, and we can tell this because tools from Clovis sites and caches show that many non local types of stone were transported great distances. However, there are instances, most notably at the Galt site in Texas, where local stone predominates the assemblage. Many archaeologists characterize these populations as small and mobile populations roaming a vast landscape. Things began to change on the plains during the onset of the Younger Dryas, which coincided with the end of the Clovis period. During this time, the climate in the northern hemisphere became abruptly colder between about 11,100 BCE and 10,800 BCE before rapidly rising around 9,700 BCE. For the plains, this meant that conditions were cooler and drier. It's impossible to generalize and just say that environmental conditions deteriorated and productivity decreased. Different areas of the plains appear to have been impacted differently. It shouldn't be surprising that after the Clovis period and during the Younger Dryas, that the human population on the plains became regionally differentiated. Tool styles became more and more localized after 11,000 BCE as people became more and more adapted to local conditions. Tool traditions like the Folsom tradition began to splinter into different tool traditions, which we aren't going to go into detail here. What's important is that people making these new tools were still making lanceolate points, just like our beloved Clovis points, but they were becoming increasingly differentiated by region. However, this time period saw an extremely important development: the expansion of the bison herds. The end of the Pleistocene saw the extinction of most of those megafauna species we mentioned earlier. Prior to those extinctions, bison populations appear to have been relatively low. After all, they had to compete with a whole host of other megafauna species for food, and this would have limited their population. Well, with those other big fellas out of the picture after the Younger Dryas, the bison began to adapt to new conditions, and they emerged as the survivors of the Pleistocene and would dominate the Great Plains thereafter. This coincided with a long-term warming trend that saw spruce and pine trees vanish from the landscape and the grasslands increase. The bison were the lone survivors of those great megafauna on a vast grassland that they were very well suited for. This development had huge consequences for later plains people. Now, originally, I had a page of this script dedicated to the bison, which turned into 2 pages, then 3, until I threw up my hands and decided to make an entire video about the bison. If you are interested in an in-depth treatment of the relationship between plains people and the bison, I'd highly recommend watching it to get an understanding of that topic. For now, and the rest of the episode, we'll be touching on points from that video, but keeping all things bison simple. The presence of bison on the plains would give paleo hunters an excellent source of food, hides, and other raw materials, and they became very important to plains cultures in the future. As important as bison were, they shouldn't blind us to other animals that were also hunted. Paleo hunters were also consuming a lot of other fauna, such as rabbits, prairie dogs, turtles, mountain sheep, deer, and antelope, to name a few. They would also exploit rivers for fish, beavers, and freshwater mussels. Archaeology shows that the proportions of such remains changed over time as different animals became more available or more desired. In fact, bison remains in some areas decreased after the Younger Dryas. We also begin to get a clearer picture of plant use as well. Plants and trees would have been used for wood, tool shafts, and cordage. However, grinding stones also show that seeds were being ground for consumption, although it's worth noting that these grinding stones could also be used for grinding pigments, wood tools, and softening hides. We also start to see the earliest evidence for pit cooking and hot rock cooking during the Paleoindian period, and these practices are going to become much more pronounced down the road. As far as other aspects of Paleoindian lifeways during the period, we can glean little from this period. These groups appear to have been highly mobile and covering large areas, judging by the presence of non-local tool materials that appear at archaeological sites. These instances show that material could be gathered or traded from faraway areas, though we can't be certain how these were acquired. By about 7000 BCE, new changes were beginning to appear on the plains, which signaled the end of the Paleo-Indian period. The following period is referred to as the Archaic, and it's usually dated from about 6900 BCE to about 600 BCE. This not only coincides with a shift away from lanceolate points to smaller points, but also with a climatic change as well called the altithermal or the hypothermal, or if you like your terms as big and grandiloquent as possible, the Holocene climatic optimum. This climatic phenomenon lasted from 7500 BCE to 3500 BCE. During this period, the climate was warmer and drier than today, and the landscape became more arid, and there are signs in some areas of erosion. In many areas, especially in the southern and western plains, the water table dropped, and several water sources on the plains may have dried up. The remains of wells dating to this period attest to the lengths that people were going to get water. Studies have shown that drought resistant midgrasses expanded across much of the plains. It would have been a rough time to be on the plains, and yet people persisted through it, though perhaps in smaller numbers than in Paleoindian times. In fact, in the western and southern plains, the archaeological record dries up, presumably because the climate made living there more difficult. Despite this development, habitation on the plains did continue. Now let's look at how people were living. As we saw at the end of the Paleoindian period, regionalism increased, and the archaeological record shows more intensive efforts to extract resources from local environments. Communication and access to distant areas seems to have decreased because tools from this time are usually made from local materials, sometimes of poorer quality. Despite these common traits, life varied greatly across the plains, but there's a pronounced difference between the northern and western plains and the southern and eastern plains. In the northern plains, archaeology documents an increasing reliance on bison, although other animals also appear in the record, and there are exceptions. At sites on the Wyoming plains, the most common animals in the archaeological record are actually rabbits. The remains of prickly pear and goosefoot also show that these groups were harvesting local plants as well. In this area where bison hunting was more prevalent, evidence shows that the bison were getting more intensively butchered and hunted. People were finding more and more uses for the bison. For example, many bison butchering sites from the later Archaic show evidence of stone boiling that was used to extract fat from crushed bone. This may sound a little underwhelming, but stay with me here. In a world without dairy, humans need a way to get fats and oils, and they typically have to get it from animals. The products of this, like bone grease, can be used like butter in cooking. But there may actually be a lot more going on here, because these instances of bone boiling might be the first instance of something very important in plains culture that we see in later historical times: pemmican. What's pemmican, you may be asking? Pemmican is a mixture of dried meat, animal tallow, and flavorings such as berries, and not only is it calorie-rich and portable, it can last for very long periods of time. This is the plains energy bar for people on the move, and we know from later historical accounts that pemmican was a very important food that could be stored for the winter or traded with other groups. It's a very fascinating dish with a history unto itself, and if you want to know more about pemmican, I'd highly recommend watching the linked Townsend video in the description. The presence of pemmican during the late Archaic would fit very nicely with another development. The late Archaic also happens to be when we see bison jumps and bison corrals appear in the archaeological record. These were new communal hunting strategies that brought several plains communities together to either drive bison off a cliff in the landscape, or in the case of bison corrals, to drive them into a large pen. Earlier plains hunters had used simpler traps in communal hunting, but these represented a leap in sophistication. These hunts required enormous planning and coordination, but if they were successful, they could result in dozens of killed bison, sometimes even more than 100. If pemmican was being produced, it explains why so much bison meat could have been processed and stored, but I do want to emphasize that there's no way to actually prove this. If you want to know more about the logistics and mechanics of these hunts, again, I highly recommend watching our video on the bison. During the Archaic, we also see the first discernible residential architecture in the archaeological record. In the western plains in modern-day Wyoming, excavations have uncovered the remains of pit houses ranging from about 3 to 6 meters. Don't get the idea that these were permanent settlements. The very light artifact records suggest that these were inhabited very briefly at any given time, but people did return to them seasonally to reuse them. However, in the grasslands, a new type of shelter was developing, and it would become so successful that it would eventually replace the pit houses on the western plains. The teepee. You might be curious how archaeologists can detect the remains of a teepee, and that's done by locating teepee rings. These are circles of stones that were once used to hold down the edge of teepees. This is an important development because it suggests a very flexible mobility that Plains people were engineering. People could literally pack up their houses and move out whenever they needed. Quick side note here. Some of you may be wondering how these teepees were moved without horses. You may be familiar with images like this that show a horse pulling a teepee in historical times. Did these people really just put these on their backs before the horse? While Plains people would have transported much of this themselves, they also had a beast of burden at their disposal: dogs. While rarely thought of today for their cargo carrying capacity, dogs could be hitched to travois. Travois? Look, I'm from the Midwest and we say Illinois and not Illinois, am I right? Anyway, travois were made from two poles in an A shape with netting or platforms lashed between them. These poles were often the very poles that would be used to construct a teepee. It was an ingenious approach to transporting goods across the plains. You might be wondering how much these dogs could actually carry. Well, some historical accounts note that some dogs could pull up to 100 pounds of cargo, but modern scholars find such claims dubious. However, a few people have actually recreated these dog travois to see how they would have worked. One of these scholars, Norman Henderson, documents his efforts in the book Rediscovering the Great Plains: Journeys by Dog, Canoe, and Horse, and found that his dog, a mature and experienced sled dog, could carry about 60 pounds over short distances, but maxed out at about 30 pounds over long distances. He also found that his dog struggled over distances in hot weather, but excelled in cooler conditions. Though I personally suspect that the sled dog he used was probably bred and trained specifically for cold weather. Other ancient breeds may have fared better in warmer weather for all that we know. If you want to go into the nitty-gritty details about the pitfalls and thrills of his experiments, I'd highly recommend getting a copy of the book. It's a wonderful read. Okay, let's get back on track. In the eastern plains, things looked a bit different. While people were still very mobile, they appear to have moved over smaller distances and inhabited the same general areas. One of the biggest differences between more northern and western areas is that bison played a smaller part in plains life, and as a result, fewer bison appear in the archaeological record in the east. Many sites have no bison remains at all. People there were consuming a much wider variety of plants and animals. They relied much more on woodland animals like deer and turkey as well as fish. Grinding stones also show that they were harvesting wild seeds for processing. We also see similar rock boiling pits to those in the west, but aside from bone boiling, people appear to have boiled nuts, especially hickory, either to separate shells from the nut meat or to extract nut oil. In the southern plains, the remains of earth ovens appear in the archaeological record. Cooking in these ovens involved burning a fire to heat rocks and then placing packets of food on the hot rocks to roast them slowly. These sites show that bulbs, desert plants, and meat were being cooked in these ovens. One of the biggest developments in the eastern periphery of the plains is the appearance of the earliest pottery. The earliest examples come from the Nebo Hill culture on the eastern edge of the plains. The type site, i.e., the site that exemplifies this culture and gives this occupation its name, is the Nebo Hill site in northwestern Missouri. In these communities, very simple pottery tempered with plant fibers have been recovered that date back to between 3000 and 1000 BCE. Although this is very limited in the late Archaic, we'll see it spread out later. These Nebo Hill sites also show that squash was being eaten as well, which suggests local cultivation of these plants. Eastern sustenance is interesting because in a lot of ways it shares a lot of similarities with archaic groups in the woodlands to the east, and it can be useful to think of the eastern plains as the westernmost extension of the woodland lifestyle that was being practiced across most of the eastern United States. And that's a useful way to segue into the next period, the Plains Woodland period, which began around 600 BCE and lasted until 950 CE. Those who know your Eastern Woodlands chronology should see that name and start drawing connections between changes that were happening east of the plains, and those connections will be a big theme during this period. Now, I want to make it clear that this phase didn't start everywhere at the same time, and in most cases, changes trickled through the plains slowly. Let's start by looking at the eastern portions of the central and southern plains, where this eastern influence was very pronounced. As I mentioned earlier, people were beginning to cultivate local plants and make pottery, and this trend continued in sections of the eastern plains. Pottery would actually spread across the plains during this period, even where there was no plant cultivation. Pottery is an interesting development because while it's very useful, it takes time to make. It's also heavy and prone to breaking, and this must have impacted the mobility of people on the plains. In general, however, people were still mobile, but were increasingly beginning to stick to certain areas. In these communities, people were still harvesting wild food from the plains and forests, but in the eastern plains, traces of domesticated foods also began to appear. Most of these eastern populations were still very mobile, but were also adopting elements of the eastern woodlands. The best example of this is the Kansas City Hopewell tradition in the Kansas City area. At about 100 BCE, startling changes appeared in the archaeology that show a clear Hopewell influence from the east. For those who are not familiar with the Hopewell, this was a large network of cultures in the Midwest and American South that shared several material, artistic, and cultural elements. Famous Hopewell sites are characterized by large and intricate earthworks, beautiful art, and exotic material that was imported over large distances. The Kansas City Hopewell, despite the name, were likely not migrants from the East. Rather, these were local people adopting new ideas from sustained contact with Hopewell exchange networks. Ceramics recovered in these excavations suggest that people were continuing local pottery traditions but with a Hopewellian flair. You can see an example of this in the similarities with this Hopewell pot from Ohio and this one from the Kansas City Hopewell. Someone was clearly emulating the cool kids, and more emulation can be seen in pipes that have been recovered. These may look like crude imitations, but they do attest to Eastern contact. But there are even bigger changes than what we see in art. Kansas City Hopewell communities practiced agriculture and built permanent settlements. At these archaeological sites, the remains of domesticated marsh elder and sunflower have been recovered, although they were still harvesting wild plants and animals as well. Even their mortuary traditions show an Eastern influence. These communities interred some of their dead in mortuary mounds, but these burials within the mounds were still interred in the same way that they were done in the late Archaic. The Kansas City Hopewell didn't last the entire Plains Woodland period, and changed when the Hopewell Exchange Network ceased to function around 500 CE. In the wake of these events, they began building smaller oval structures and resumed their mobile lifestyle, never staying in one place for very long. The Kansas City Hopewell is a dramatic example of the plains meeting the eastern woodland. But this wasn't the case everywhere, and there's an interesting continuum across the plains. Full sedentism was very rare in the plains at this time. Further west in Nebraska, Kansas, and Oklahoma, people built homes, made pottery, and in some cases even made mounds, but remained semi-sedentary, and continued to rely on wild plants, nuts, and hunted game for sustenance. Even eastern communities in the southern plains, like those in southwestern Missouri and northeastern Oklahoma, that show a strong Hopewell influence, also show little difference in sustenance from earlier archaic times. It's worth noting that many of these groups returned to the same areas to bury or inter their dead, which suggests that certain areas were becoming linked to certain groups of people. In the northern plains, the biggest change in the archaeological record is the intensification of bison hunting. Remember how I mentioned that during the later Archaic, people began to utilize communal hunting methods like bison jumps? Well, this really took off in the Plains Woodland period because archaeology shows us that kill sites with jumps and corrals were reused regularly, and those could result in huge amounts of killed bison. All the surplus hides, meat, bones, and other products were likely traded with their neighbors. Bison hides and bones were appreciated for their durability, and even in historical times, these were always in high demand from people that had limited access to bison. Obviously, this trade is sometimes difficult to discern in archaeology because these items are all perishable. Judging from later trade that is much better documented in archaeology, many archaeologists believe that the rapid intensification of bison hunting we see in the archaeological record represents the blossoming of this trade. Some authors even describe this intensification as an industrialization of bison hunting. This also coincides with the appearance of the bow and arrow in the archaeological record. Northern plains hunters appeared to have switched from the spear thrower to the bow and arrow as their preferred hunting weapon, and in many ways, this made hunting much easier and safer. Before we leave the northern plains completely, I do want to draw attention to rock art, which has a noteworthy development. Art from the Woodland period begins to depict warriors with huge body-sized bison hide war shields and spears. This suggests that warriors and warfare were becoming more important. Although the Plains Woodland period appears to have been peaceful, there are some instances of violence in the archaeological record, particularly with arrow wounds and human remains. This is an ominous foreshadowing of things to come. Before we wrap up the Plains Woodland, however, we need to look at the southwestern plains, particularly the area south of modern Amarillo and west of the Texas and Oklahoma border. Until now, we've talked about eastern woodland influences permeating the plains, but in the southwestern plains, there's none of that. Instead, there's a strong southwestern and Puebloan influence. In fact, it's better to think of the western edge of the southern plains as an extension of the southwestern cultural zone. The inhabitants there had strong cultural connections with the basket maker and Mogollon cultures. This is evident when we look at pottery that has been recovered from these sites. In eastern New Mexico, along the Pecos River, Woodland period communities used Jornada Mogollon brownware, often made in southwestern New Mexico. Here, people were living in small scattered communities in shallow pit houses, and some of them were beginning to farm small amounts of maize. Further east in the Texas Panhandle, there's also a strong southwestern influence. People in this area, referred to as the Palo Duro complex, were making coiled brownwares and also living in pit houses like their southwestern neighbors, although no evidence of maize farming has been recovered from this period. Instead, these inhabitants were harvesting acorns, mesquite, and other plants, and also hunting deer, antelope, and small game. Bison bones are found in archaeology, but they're rare. The picture we get is that these groups had little to no interaction with other plains communities to the north and east. The Woodland period was a time of important transformation in all areas of the plains, as networks with populations inside and outside of the plains took shape. Trade and exchange became much more visible, and plains communities continued localizing and began creating pottery that often took influence from their neighbors. Although some domesticates began to appear in a few areas, most people were still generalists, hunting and gathering local flora and fauna. We also see the first signs of violence on the plains, too, which shows that social identities were becoming more pronounced, and competition for goods and territory was increasing. As transformative as the Woodland period was, far more dramatic changes would shape the following period, the Plains Village period. Archaeologists date the beginning of this period at 950 or 1000 CE. Let's start in the Central Plains. This area probably saw the most drastic changes, and we can trace a lot of that change to a very important development on the Mississippi River, the city of Cahokia. We've already covered Cahokia and its legacy in detail on this channel before, so I will keep it simple. Cahokia was a turning point in the cultural development of the eastern woodlands and laid the foundation for Mississippian culture that shaped the eastern woodlands for centuries to come. That influence stretched up and down the Mississippi Basin, into the southeastern U.S., and even into the eastern plains. As successful as Cahokia was, its heyday only lasted about a few centuries. At 1200 CE, it was in decline, and by 1350, it was abandoned. At its peak, Cahokia was a massive city, with a dense population between 10 and 20,000 people, with even more people residing outside the city. Most of these people were farming maize full-time, a radical new way of life in eastern North America. We're going to see that Cahokia left a lasting impact on the plains. Let's discuss the biggest impact first, maize. And this is when we see maize farming truly take hold in the eastern plains. You may be asking why people even bothered with maize agriculture. After all, agriculture forces people to stay in an area for an extended period of time. It requires a lot of labor to clear the land, plant crops, tend those crops, and then harvest them. In a way, it's very at odds with the plains lifestyle that we've seen up until now. Time spent farming is time not spent elsewhere. You may be curious whether maize agriculture was brought to the plains by farmers moving into the plains, or whether plains inhabitants adopted farming on their own. There's much debate and no clear answer, but it's likely that farming spread out by both means in different areas. It's worth noting that many people migrated onto the plains, especially after Cahokia's decline, and would have brought traditions of maize farming with them. People on the plains certainly could have been more receptive to farming than we realize. Plains populations may have grown to the point that maize farming was needed to combat resource imbalances, and it may have been a way to increase food security. Also, maize would have given plains communities additional resources to trade with their neighbors. Perhaps a combination of all these reasons were taken into account. Regardless, maize agriculture fundamentally changed life for many people on the plains. During Cahokia's rise, maize agriculture spread across the Midwestern U.S., and in the ensuing centuries, this trickled into the plains. Obviously, maize farming didn't appear everywhere on the plains at once. This took time to spread, and some areas of the plains were not affected by these developments at all. Between 1050 and 1100 CE, maize farming appeared in northwestern Iowa and in the Kansas City area. By 1200 CE, maize farming had spread to communities further west in the central plains along the major rivers. These communities farmed in floodplains along the rivers in order to maximize the moisture available to the crops. Maize could be grown in dry land farming, but this relied on rainfall during the growing season, which only would have been possible east of the 100th meridian shown here. But even that wasn't certain, because plains weather could be unpredictable, and poorly timed precipitation or drought could greatly reduce a crop yield. Plains farmers also had to have access to additional land so that they could allow previous maize fields to lie fallow and rejuvenate. There's no evidence that these farmers used fertilizers or irrigation. One last thing to point out, maize was not the only plant that was cultivated by plains farmers. Many plains farmers also grew beans, sunflowers, squash, and tobacco, although some relied more exclusively on maize. These early farmers in the Central Plains are referred to in the literature as the Central Plains Tradition, or CPT for short. This tradition began in the late 1100s around northeastern Kansas and southeastern Nebraska before expanding into the Central Plains during the 13th and 14th centuries. By 1250, maize was even being cultivated as far north as North Dakota. Early CPT homes and communities show a strong Cahokian influence. Besides maize agriculture, they also created shell-tempered pottery and clay pipes similar to those in the East. Central Plains people were devoted horticulturalists growing a variety of crops with maize, but also hunted local game and foraged wild plants as their ancestors had done. Some farmers further west even balanced farming and regular bison hunting, and future CPT communities in the 1400s appear to have made greater investment in bison hunting. Central Plains people lived in dispersed communities near rivers where they could take advantage of farming on the floodplains. Their homes show a diversity of design, but typically use a square or rectangular dugout plan with a central hearth and 4 posts to hold up a roof. The walls would either have been made with wattle and daub or could have been covered with earth and roofed with either thatch or earth. These are a prelude to what is perhaps the most famous architecture on the plains after the teepee, the Earth Lodge. These were semi-subterranean, dome-shaped buildings with a wooden frame supported in the center by wooden posts and covered in earth. These represented a significant investment of time and labor to construct, but were very important communal spaces. Mortuary traditions in the Central Plains also show a lot of variety as well, with individual burials and collective burials, and this is a valuable clue to the cultural diversity that was forming during this period. In the 13th century, we see a really interesting and visible instance of Eastern people migrating into the plains. This is referred to by archaeologists as the Oneota tradition, which has its roots in southern Wisconsin from maize farmers that adopted Mississippian culture from Cahokia. After Cahokia's collapse, many of these Oneota farmers moved west into the plains through northern Iowa, and these were likely Siouan-speaking people that later became the historical Iowa, Omaha, and Ponca, among others. This Cahokian influence is strong, and we can see this not just in maize farming, but in pottery and architecture. Oneota pottery in early Plains village times is very distinct because it's often decorated on the shoulder with Mississippian symbols. The Oneota lived in much larger communities with houses built in the Cahokian style, with dugout floors, wall trenches, and wattle and daub walls. Later on, Oneota communities would also build longhouses with similar construction techniques. Oneota were primarily horticultural but also hunted local game extensively. Some of you may be wondering what the CPT farmers thought of these new arrivals. Archaeology shows that Oneota and CPT people lived side by side, and in some instances, Central Plains communities even adopted some Oneota style pottery decorations. Some CPT communities even began building large villages like their northern neighbors along the Missouri River. The best and largest example of this is the Lynch site in northern Nebraska. Here, a CPT town was constructed over 150 acres on a bluff overlooking a creek. This was a huge shift from the earlier dispersed CPT communities in earlier times. However, there's also some evidence that there was violent interaction between these groups. A few CPT cemeteries have been found featuring embedded Oneota projectile points and even signs of scalping. While we're on the subject of violence, this is something that began to really ramp up in the later Plains Village period. People in the central and northern plains began to aggregate in larger and larger settlements for protection, and many of these communities began building fortifications like ditches and palisades around their settlements. This wasn't always the case, though. There were still many instances of unfortified settlements, but it's safe to say that certain areas at certain times were becoming dangerous and violent. No site better illustrates this than the Crow Creek site in South Dakota. Sometime after 1300, this heavily fortified settlement was stormed and the inhabitants brutally massacred. Over 400 bodies were recovered in excavations, and the evidence shows that this violence was not random, but was coordinated. If you are interested in learning more about this site and its macabre history, archaeologist Nathaniel Fossane has a great video about the archaeology of the site. During the 1400s, fortified towns began to spread across the northern and upper central plains. Even hunter-gatherer groups sometimes built fortifications around seasonal settlements that they returned to regularly. Rock art in the northern plains depicting shield-bearing warriors with spears also testifies to a strong warrior tradition that had developed, likely similar to the warrior societies that are known from the 18th and 19th centuries. Some of these depictions even show massed lines of warriors in an organized fashion. And speaking of the northern plains, let's turn our attention there. In this area, agriculture didn't penetrate very far like it did in the central plains. Farming was prevalent in the southern regions of South Dakota, and we just saw how many of those settlements were fortified. The northern and western plains remained settled by hunter-gatherer populations as they had during the Archaic and Woodland periods, and bison hunting remained central to their lives. However, we shouldn't think of the people living in these areas as a people trapped in time, because they were seeing their own developments too. Not only that, there's lots of evidence that they had contact with their horticultural neighbors. The increasing archaeological visibility of bison products being traded attests to this. As we discussed earlier, by the late Woodland period, bison hunting was intensifying, and the overproduction of bison products began to feed a very lucrative trade with eastern neighbors. In the Plains Village period, maize remains begin to appear in the archaeological remains of these communities, despite the fact that they were not farming. They were getting their maize from Eastern agriculturalists, most likely in exchange for bison products. Not just meat, mind you, but hides, furs, bone, and pemmican. One item that was very prized by agriculturalists were farming hoes made with bison scapulae, often called scapula hoes, and remains of these pop up in Plains archaeology. These same people were also altering their pottery to make it more globular and thinner so that they could be better suited for cooking foods like maize. Many of these pots are also decorated with designs from nearby Plains villages, which also attests to the links between these peoples. This was extremely productive trade, and it persisted until European contact. Okay, let's shift our attention to the southern plains, where there's a very interesting spectrum of cultures, and we're going to work our way from east to west. Like the central plains, maize agriculture had a huge impact in the south. Between 1000 and 1100 CE, maize agriculture began to appear in western Arkansas, eastern Oklahoma, and East Texas, though not all of these groups were farming full time. Eastern groups in the South also had a lot of Mississippian influence from Cahokia, and also from the later Mississippian site of Spiro on the eastern border of Oklahoma, and from the related Caddoan communities. In these central Oklahoma communities, houses here share a similar square plan with wall trenches and entry corridors. Like their Central Plains counterparts, they were also farming maize, but few other crops. They also relied on wild plants and hunting game to supplement their diet. Pottery from these agriculturalists also show close links to Caddoan and Mississippian communities further east, often using Caddoan-inspired motifs. Further west in the Panhandle region, maize farming arrived after 1250, but like other western people on the plains, they also relied heavily on hunting local fauna, and especially bison. This region is particularly interesting because they were important middlemen in a trade network between the Southwest and the plains. In the early Plains Village period, one prominent trade item from this area was Alabates agate, which was mined and then traded across the southern and central plains by the Antelope Creek culture. There's also some limited evidence of trade with people in the Southwest, judging from southwestern obsidian and pottery, but these are rare in the archaeological record. All of this activity put them in contact with a lot of people, and we see this reflected in local architecture. Some people in this area built similar four-post structures like their eastern neighbors, while other settlements built pit houses. Some communities even built multi-room structures with stone bases. Western exchange would develop further in the ensuing centuries, but to appreciate that, let's look at the southwestern plains, where that southwestern culture was still going strong. In the Plains Village period, most communities lived in pit houses and balanced farming maize, squash, and beans with hunting wild game and harvesting wild plants. As we saw in the Woodland period, pottery from these populations shows a very close affinity to the Southwest. In southern Colorado and northern New Mexico, people imported huge amounts of pottery from communities in the Taos area, but also copied their designs. Later people in the area, the Apishapa, decorated their pottery in cord-marked plain style, but analysis shows that these pots were not made with the paddle and anvil technique that plains potters used. Instead, these pots were coiled, the preferred technique used by southwestern potters, which suggests a cultural connection to southwestern pottery traditions. Further south in the Pecos Valley, a much more complex picture emerges. Here, Puebloan and Mogollon peoples moved into the plains and brought their traditions with them, even building large multi-room pueblos in some cases. One place where we can really see this is around Roswell, New Mexico. The people here created a new way of life by exploiting the local game like deer and pronghorn, despite also practicing limited farming. However, the real prize to be had were the bison. These communities could hunt bison on the plains and send bison products to the west in exchange for pottery and other exotic goods. At one of these sites, the Blue Mound site, archaeologists recovered large amounts of copper bells, marine shell, and turquoise, indicating a thriving trade network centered on moving bison products into the Southwest. You may be wondering why these bison products were so sought after. Archaeologists may have an answer to that. Investigations have shown that Pueblo populations in the Pecos River Valley were suffering from nutritional deficiencies, and bison meat would have been a highly valued food to stave off malnutrition. In the increasingly violent Southwest, some have speculated that bison hides would have also been valued as material for war shields. Bison products even show up in Mogollon settlements in the Sacramento Mountains in southern New Mexico, so these were in high demand. All that would suddenly change at the end of the Plains Village period when new immigrants from the western plains, referred to by later Spanish sources as the Teas and Carechos, arrived in the southwestern plains and pushed out the Pueblo and Mogollon inhabitants from the plains. And there's evidence to suggest that this was not a peaceful event. Blue Mound, the site we mentioned earlier, was attacked and burned around 1450. Excavated houses at the site have revealed unburied bodies of people that were killed during the attack. These new arrivals were not agriculturalists, but rather full-time hunter-gatherers who specialized in bison hunting. For hundreds of years, the southwestern peoples had populated the western fringes of the southern plains, but by the end of the Plains Village period, this area was fully incorporated into the Plains cultural sphere. This didn't mean that the new inhabitants turned their backs on their southwestern neighbors. Far from it. They continued those earlier trade networks, moving bison products out of the plains and into the southwest. When Coronado arrived in the plains in 1542, this network was still in place. The most drastic cultural change on the plains, however, would come with European colonization. Not only would disease and colonization take their toll on ancient lifeways, but the introduction of the horse transformed life on the plains. The earliest horses were adopted in the southern plains around 1630 and slowly spread northward. By 1730, they had spread up into the Canadian plains, although they didn't become common in that area until a few decades later. Horses replaced dogs as the beast of burden on the plains, and travois were redesigned and bulked up to fit horses. Interestingly, the word for horse in some plains languages actually translates to big dog. With horses carrying cargo, plains material culture was no longer limited to what people and their dogs could carry. They could transport more goods than ever before. Another part of life that was impacted was hunting. Horses could finally allow plains people to track the bison and hunt them on a hitherto unimagined scale. By the time most settlers arrived on the plains, the horse was a fixture in plains cultures. Now, we aren't going to get into the conquest of the Great Plains. This video is plenty long, but if you are interested in learning more, you can check out History Dose's video on the collapse of the Plains Nations or Knowing Better's video on Indian removal. They're both really good, and I'll link them both below. In wrapping this up, I'm struck by how the plains are often thought of as a frontier or a backwater in the American consciousness. In the first impressions of early European and American explorers, it was often maligned as a wasteland. Today, a lot of people think of it as flyover country, and that's a shame, because once upon a time, it was a land of vibrant culture and exchange that took in inspiration from its neighbors and also gave inspiration back. We've seen examples of people coming into the plains from the Midwest and Southwest to have access to the open space, farmland, and bison. This even continued into historical times when later people, such as the Lakota and the Cheyenne, migrated into the plains and adopted the plains lifestyle. This was not a backwater, but a vibrant cultural zone that interacted with the rest of the continent. To the people that inhabited the plains, it was a great land of big skies and big possibilities. It's a shame that the vast farms, ranches, and roads that cover the plains now prevent us from seeing its beauty. If you ever find yourself in plains country, hit up the local state or national park and just admire the beauty of the landscape, and remember that for thousands of years, this was home to millions of people. Once again, special thanks to my patrons for supporting my work and for selecting this topic. You guys are the best. If you would like to join the ranks of these fine individuals and support the show, you can do so on Patreon. The link will be in the description. A very special thanks also goes out to Dr. Carlton Shield Chief Gover for his invaluable assistance with this episode. Don't forget to subscribe and follow us on Facebook. We'll see you in our next episode. Take care.